Mike Jones, by the grace of God, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. Would you like to tell the audience first what happened to you and to your colleague, Masha?
Thank you, Mr. Galloway, once again for having me on. Yes, I will be as brief as I can. Yeah, we're both safe. We always were. Whilst we were kind of at risk, we were in good company. Unfortunately, YouTube didn't enable me to inform my audience myself, thanks to a back-to-back ban where they banned me twice in a row, which unfortunately led to some upset and, as you say, some unnecessary worry from people for an undue length of time.
Did you just get lost, or were communications cut off? There was no internet? What happened? You can tell me, just between us.
Somewhat careful with what I say. So a day trip to Soledar and the front lines there to see the situation, things got a little bit hot. So we found ourselves unintentionally embedded with a frontline infantry unit of soldiers south of Bakhmut. And of course, due to Ukrainian tactics whereby they track foreign SIM cards, you have to not only put your telephone on airplane mode, but also disable location GPS tracking on it. So I had to go completely black and completely dark. This was unintended. Unfortunately, we were supposed to be back, obviously, at our hotel that evening. But due to the situation, which I'm told resulted in even the general of the unit having to be evacuated rather quickly, we, of course, fell down the level of priority. And I've been in the army and I understand what it's like. So a transport that was supposed to come for us was, of course, diverted elsewhere. So we spent the night in a basement, which was surprisingly comfortable south of Bakhmut. With some amazing guys, really incredible, a range of guys, young and old. And I was quite quickly accepted into them, despite my nationality and some sort of standoffish looks to begin with. I was told my Russian is spoken without an accent, which also didn't help, perhaps for a while, with some MI6 jokes. But when I told them my story and my motivations, they very quickly understood, and they told me that it was a huge morale booster to hear the level of support from the West, and also that people like myself are doing what I'm doing and aren't afraid to go to the front lines to see for themselves what's going on. So that was a particularly valuable and moving experience. I also found myself joined on the front.
Yeah,
carry on.
Yeah, let's turn to the war in general then. Any sign of that Ukrainian counteroffensive?
You may say in some words there was some increase in activity on certain front lines, but from what I asked of it, no, there doesn't appear to be this much lauded counteroffensive that we've been promised. The military expert Andrei Marochko told me that it's an information counteroffensive. It's a propaganda counteroffensive at this point in time. Whether it transpires that it forms into an actual physical offensive, we shall see. But I'm leaning towards agreeing with him. But there was some fairly intense shelling when I got back to Donetsk. There was an attack on a civil administration building the day I arrived. 6 HIMARS were fired at this building, timed, incidentally, with a pause between the initial strike to hit the journalists and emergency services later. It was posted on the subreddit r/Ukraine, where they celebrated the fact that propagandists were hit by HIMARS on this civilian administration center in Donetsk later on. So that's what I'm seeing of the counteroffensive in the Donbass region so far.
Although they did send terrorists inside Russia in American military vehicles, can you tell us any more than most people already know about that, namely that they're all dead? But how did they get in and how much damage did they do?
From the last I read, one civilian, I believe he was a clerk of the border guard, was shot in the back of the head by these saboteurs, as they're called. Approximately 80 of them infiltrated into the Belgorod region. And initially, Ukraine tried to distance itself and said that this was the Russian Freedom Legion, or they tried to put it on some internal group. However, the fact that American equipment was very visible and quite clearly used, MRAP vehicles, for instance, then put pay to that theory that this was an internal struggle or uprising of some nature. So this was very definitely something masterminded by Kiev. Remember that this occurred very shortly after the fall of Bakhmut, which must have been an incredible blow to morale in Ukraine. So it served its purpose at the cost of 80 human lives. Media attention was drawn away from this crushing blow to Ukraine. And that, again, said a lot about the Kiev regime, and served, again, once more, as we've seen with many of these sort of propaganda efforts, has only served to solidify Russian resolve.
They're always trying this false flag story, aren't they? They did it over this column that entered Russia. They did it over the drone attack on the Kremlin, which the United States now accepts was a Ukrainian operation. They did it over the Nord Stream, where they tried to blame Russia for blowing up its own gas pipelines. And now the German government has said that the arrow points at Ukraine as having been the perpetrator of that. And they've done it, of course, in various military situations, the maternity hospital in Mariupol, I think it was, in the massacre that they themselves carried out in Bucha. This is standard operating practice for them, isn't it?
Yeah, it's become almost farcical at certain points. We've seen this strike in Dnipro that was supposedly blamed on Russia, then very quickly turned out to be an S-300 missile by all accounts from the studies of the explosions. Then CNN reports that Ukraine's AA defense is working better than ever. And yet somehow Russia still was responsible for striking this outpatient clinic, when quite clearly the evidence seems to point to the fact that it was a Ukrainian anti-air missile that went astray and once again hit a civilian area. And we saw it in Kiev as well, with these anti-aircraft missiles going off and hitting residential buildings. Very quickly, the BBC picked up on that and blamed Russia for it. Again, when you hear the news, and I often get sent letters and emails asking me, is this the case? When I start to dig deeper into the details, a very common theme occurs with many of these propaganda spins and false flags and atrocities that are leveled at Russia. Now, I'm not saying Russia is blameless by any means, and I'm certainly not saying that mistakes aren't made and that missiles don't go astray. But just 9 times out of 10, you can normally, with your critical thinking, cut through all that rubbish and start to understand the common theme that occurs.
Well, I'm old enough to remember when one of the missiles landed in Poland, and Zelensky himself told us that it was a Russian attack on Poland until it wasn't, and the Americans themselves announced that it was a Ukrainian anti-aircraft missile. What about the raids on Kiev? There's been a stepping up of Russian bombardment in Kiev. What are they hitting there?
From what I understand, and do forgive me, I have been out of the loop for the past 10 days somewhat, given being near the front lines. But for the most part, as I understand, these are critical infrastructure, generally energy related, to prevent the supply of these Western weapons. We had that radiation fiasco after the British ammunition was seemingly detonated in the west of Ukraine, causing a lot of embarrassment. From what I'm told, the monitoring website has seemingly gone down or inactive, where it appears, and I don't know this for a fact, do correct me in the comments on YouTube if I'm incorrect here, but it seems they are not wishing to publish the gamma radiation levels that have seemingly increased in that area. So this appears to be the aim. So targeting the stockpiling of these weapons and neutralizing them before they can be utilized on the front line. And this is also applied off the record to Leopard tanks as well that have been destroyed. But we shall see some evidence of that shortly, I hope.
Now, the F-16s are on their way, or are they? Who's going to fly them? Ukrainian pilots clearly cannot fly them. Are they going to put mercenaries in the cockpit, do you think?
I have no doubt, absolutely. These will be volunteers. To quote Scott Ritter, sheep dipped as Ukrainian pilots. The last I heard, the Netherlands were offering their F-16s to start with. I don't envy the guys that have to sit in the cockpits of these things. I do believe that the integrated air defense systems of the Russian Federation will wipe them out. Russia has air superiority over Ukraine, and these aircraft won't be a match for certainly not the S-400 systems. So I expect that there will be a combination of use of the Storm Shadow long-range missiles with the F-16s. I believe they will be further used, as I showed on Telegram, where I published a video where I visited the Lugansk Center for Joint Communication and Coordination of these strikes, where I showed the proof of Storm Shadow missiles being used against civil and civilian areas in Lugansk, which is an area that previously hadn't been able to be reached by Ukraine. But I expect that F-16s will be employed to fire off these Storm Shadow missiles and other long-range munitions, given the dwindling supply of the Soviet aircraft that Ukraine has left at this point in time.
Why has Russia moved nuclear weapons into Belarus?
I expect that this is a little bit of a chess game where there's the Queen has been moved into one position, and now NATO has to reconfigure and really understand that if they want to keep playing this game, if they don't want to start negotiations, then they really have to. It sounds hollow at this point, with this escalation that's kept going on and on and on. Especially when it comes to NATO, they've done some things that have really left me quite baffled. I think Lukashenko has welcomed this move as well, which, again, one has to consider, given that, if Belarus is therefore a target, the population is at risk, but he must be sufficiently assured that the presence of these weapons in his country is a sufficient deterrent to NATO, and I'm including Finland there as well, newly admitted members, to actually just reconsider their behavior and their involvement, and whether they really do want to continue going the way they're going, or whether they can actually consider an off-ramp at this point.
Well, Mr. Lavrov said today that the Americans have to come to their senses, or hell will be the result. What do you think he meant by that?
I think it's pretty literal. I think the way that the West is continuing to antagonize, and it's not just even with nuclear, it's with chemical and biological weapons as well, specifically chemical. They're employing them with extensive use along the front lines, along certainly Donetsk, where I saw evidence of their use. They continue to use every other tactic employed to try and antagonize. And I think Russia is really doing its best. As we've seen, they don't react, they don't employ knee-jerk reactions, but they are very clear and very precise in both their wording and their actions. And I hope that perhaps this message is heard and read by the West, but that hope is quite thin at this point.
Indeed thin, as it should be, because this trusting in the endless patience of Russia must be increasingly being tested. And my reading of Mr. Lavrov's remarks today were a little darker than yours. I thought it was the most hawkish thing that he has said. I wonder if Russia's strategic patience is not very close to running out.
Well, Shoigu himself had said that there are only so many steps and we're rapidly running out of them. I would agree with you. Actually, Lavrov is generally very measured, very calm. He's the commensurate diplomat and statesman, probably one of the finest we've seen of our time at this point. But yeah, I think that is a good reading of his words. And I think that's intended as well, that this can only go on so long. And yes, these parties that are Lindsey Graham springs to mind today, as well. His words. He's been one of the worst that I've come across. These, I'll watch my words. These individuals need to really reconsider and rethink their strategies, and perhaps eat some humble pie and just admit that they haven't achieved their stated aims and goals in destroying the Russian Federation.